All right, thank you all for coming. Our speaker tonight is Josh Dickson. He is an addictions counselor, trauma therapist, and positive psychologist, and the founder and, clinical director of Resurface. Please join me in welcoming Josh Dickson.
Thank you, Razzie. Is this coming out? Can you hear me okay? Is it? Yeah, cool. Okay. So this is a talk on sense of life, and how I'm just going to talk to you about how my work relates to this concept of sense of life. But what I want to do is read out to you first Ayn Rand's definition, or what she writes about sense of life, and then take things from there. Now, she says a sense of life is a preconceptual equivalent of metaphysics, an emotional, subconsciously integrated appraisal of man and of existence. It sets the nature of a man's emotional responses and essence of his character. Long before he's old enough to grasp such a concept as metaphysics, man makes choices, forms value judgments, experiences emotions, and acquires a certain implicit view of life. Every choice and value judgment implies some estimate of himself and of the world around him, most particularly of his capacity to deal with the world. He may draw conscious conclusions, which may be true or false. He may remain mentally passive and merely react to events, as in I merely just feel. Whatever the case may be, his subconscious mechanism sums up his psychological activities, integrating his conclusions, reactions, or evasions into an emotional sum that establishes a habitual pattern and becomes his automatic response to the world around him. What began as a series of single, discrete conclusions about his own particular problems becomes a generalized feeling about existence, an implicit metaphysics with the compelling motivational power of a constant basic emotion, an emotion which is part of all of his other emotions, underlies all his experiences. This is a sense of life. So that's what she's talking about, and I just thought what I wanted to do is relate it in terms of the work that I do and in psychology in general as I see it. So can people in the room relate to someone who they might say is a joy thief or a joy killer? People know anyone like that? Yeah. And do people know people who light up a room, make you feel good when you're in their company? You know, they resonate benevolence and goodness. And then we got that whole spectrum in between. I very rarely come across the second one in my work. They usually don't need therapy. But I come across with a lot of people who have a very sort of depressive, negative, pessimistic view of the world. And I think if I could just get across one thing to you tonight, is that sense of life, that sense of where you see the world, how it works, whether you have choices, whether anything you do makes any difference. I see that change. I see that change quite a lot in people. The old thinking was that these things were determined, they were set, and there wasn't pretty much you could do about it. And I've seen many, many people come through the other way. Also, I bet some of you have you like not seen someone for like, maybe a decade or so, and the next time you see them, they're really down compared to what they used to be like. That kind of the opposite has happened. Their sense of life is in many ways diminished. So some people's sense of life gets better and better and better, as in it's more optimistic, more benevolent. And other people I've seen the opposite happen. And this can be reflected in the clothes they're wearing, the music they're listening to, the films and TV shows they're recommending, etc. The sense of life kind of drives everything. But as in that reading I was saying, a sense of life isn't one particular thing. It's an aggregate. It's a summation of many things. Now I see that a sense of life is really driven by, I think, initial sense of life until you become conscious of it and you start working on it. Until that time, or you become aware of just the concept sense of life. Until that time, it's very much driven by early childhood experiences. Attachment issues and trauma, basically, I think, are the main issues that drive either a negative or positive sense of life. So when I say trauma, I'd say a lack of trauma is much more likely to result in a benevolent sense of life. And a childhood full of trauma is most likely to drive a negative sense of life. And then we have the attachment issues. How present was your primary caregiver for you in those crucial first 3-4 years? And not necessarily, primary caregiver doesn't have to be mum or dad. You know, I've worked with plenty of people who parents are absent, but they had a nanny or a maternity nurse or someone like that who was a really solid figure in their life, you know, a primary caregiver of sorts, and that was enough for someone to develop a benign and content way of seeing the world. But also I've really, regret to say, but it probably wouldn't surprise you, that most of the people that I meet and see is the other way around. I've recently been working with someone whose father raped them for the first, age 4 to 13, 14. In my mind, it's a miracle that they're still alive. It's a miracle that they haven't killed themselves. They've spoken about it a lot, but there's part of them, this is the amazing thing that I get from the work that I do. A lot of people say, doesn't it destroy you? Doesn't it bring you down? And some days it does. Some days it's really dark. And sometimes I feel a bit sick, and sometimes I wonder what the hell I'm doing. But most of the time, I have to say, I'm absolutely floored in a positive way by people's resilience, by people's ability to survive, by people's ability to reframe their existence to get through. You know, that there is, even in these, and these are genuine victims, not the sort of victim culture victims that people talk about. I'm talking about like true victims. You know, people are literally tortured, mentally tortured, imprisoned, etc., by parents, etc. And I am amazed by how people are able to survive. And it needs to be looked at, though. And these people who I work with, I see, not in all of them, some people give up. Some people have what we might call it in psychology a trauma identity. They're so wedded to a way of being. They're so wedded to how their life has been that they really struggle to be able to see it any other way. But I'd actually say that's quite rare. I'd say that most of the people I work with in that context that I started with just now, they want to be free of that. They want to live. They want to have a happy life. They want to be able to thrive and flourish, and they want to be rid of these things that hold them back. But I would say most of these people I'm talking about here have a very negative sense of life, and it doesn't surprise me. If you're that let down from such an early age, that confused, these people are told that when you grow, when after a certain amount of years you're going to become a grown-up. Yet they have this, why the hell would I want to be a grown-up when grown-ups do this to me? So I'd say that, a sense of life, a negative sense of life is almost quite rational in many ways in some of these people I work with. And I think that what would be useful is, I always say, we use big examples so that each of you in the room can extrapolate from the big example and maybe try and apply it to your own life. So when I'm talking about someone as damaged or as abused as someone who's raped by their father repeatedly for a decade, and they can get through it, and they can change, and they can really make tremendous strides in how they see the world. I think it makes it easier for other people to go, okay, I think I can do something myself to change. I've been a bit neggy recently. I'm a bit down. My friends are starting to tell me I'm a bit down, and there are ways of changing it. Because if these people can change it, then I'm not trying to make some kind of motivational speech from a movie, but if these people can change, then I think all of you can take those principles for yourselves. We have to look at what's going on cognitively. What are the core beliefs that I have about myself and my relation to the world? And negative cognitions fall into 4 domains. I'm self-defective, so I'm unlovable, I'm weak, I'm inadequate, I'm stupid, I'm ugly. These are the things that people play over and over in their minds. And these beliefs of self-worth, what we find, there's a correlation between the earlier the childhood trauma, the more likely it is that you're going to have cognitions of negative self-worth. So I find that when I'm working with people, that when the trauma happened under, say, age 7 is the sort of cut-off point between what we call the pre and post and cognitive stages. That these are the beliefs that tend to get integrated, and there's some good reasons for that. A child will nearly always blame themselves because the other way of looking at it is too horrific for them to even contemplate. I'll repeat that. A child will often blame themselves because the other way of looking at it is often too... It would cause like a psychotic break in a child. You imagine that the very person that you rely on for everything is out to get you. That's too much for most children. So children will often come up with, it must be something about me. There must be something wrong with me. And this is something that in adulthood, we have to start challenging. One of the saddest things that happens with, we call CSA, childhood sexual abuse, is that children take on the shame. They take on the shame is such a strange emotion and concept, because it's usually, shame is taking on the behavior of someone else, as if it says something about you. People say, I'm so embarrassed, or I'm so ashamed of my parents. Kids at school and stuff, in quite a benign way as well. Like, oh God, they're so embarrassing. As if it says something about them. As if the behavior of someone else is your fault. But so many people do this, and it's something that needs to be really worked through. But the shame of being targeted, the shame of being abused, the shame of being held back, these are things that people integrate and take into themselves, and then they start to believe that I am shameful. And we really need to start challenging that. Because we haven't got all night, I'm just going to keep going through this. So we've got that main cognition of being self-defective, domain of negative beliefs. Then we've got the domain of safety. I'm unsafe, I'm in danger, I'm going to die. And we've probably all seen and met these people in our lives who are always nervous about everything, thinking that something is about to go wrong at all times. And usually that's what will be going on round and round in their head, is that I'm in danger of some sort. And again, if this has happened at an early age, no wonder that's going to be integrated. And we have to work on that. We have to look at, what is it that you really think is going to happen? What are the examples of this happening in your life? And is it still happening now? So we've got the domain of self-defectiveness. We've got the domain of safety. The third main domain that is instilled, usually a little bit older than 7, is the domain of control, helplessness. Does anything that I do make any difference? Do I have any agency in the world? Or do I take something that's I've got no control in this part of my life and make it about all of my life? We got a general election coming up. How much control do each of us have in that? Very little. But there's some people who will take that to mean that they have no control in anything in their lives. And again, if you're imprisoned or abused or held back at a very early age, it'd be quite normal to integrate that into your life. So we have to look at, are you plagued by or held back by cognitions of having no control? And then the fourth domain that is much more rare is the sense of responsibility. I should have done something different. And in my experience, this doesn't come up nearly so much as the others, but it's still there. You know, the classic one would be, I should have run back in the house and saved the dog from the house fire. Or I should have said something different. I should have done something different. And that exists there, but it's not such a big one. And all of these negative cognitions will drive a certain sense of life. The inverse or converse is true, that if you have those cognitions that I'm capable, I'm adequate, I'm lovable, if these things are instilled in you and you integrate those in an early age, you'll have like a benign, benevolent sense of life. But again, I never really see many of these people in my work because they don't need it. I'm glad to meet them in my life as an example. And I'd love to be able to use some of these people as a good case example. But, you know, they don't often need the work that me and countless of my colleagues are offering. So we have to look at what kind of cognitions would drive a negative sense of life. We also have to look at what's going on somatically. Because what also happens is when people are traumatized in any way, the body responds in certain ways, the nervous system responds in certain ways. And one of the things that I will often see that will drive a negative sense of life is a belief that you have no control over your body reactions. Because, you know, like, for example, an example that's used all the time is what happened to veterans after war. And the most studied group of veterans was the Vietnam vets in the 70s, when PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was first really taken seriously. Is you'd have people who would hear a bang and fall to the floor in a sort of almost powerless manner. They'd get back up and someone would say, "Hey, buddy, the war's over." You know, in the mid-80s, when a lot of the work was being done. And they'd say, "I know the war's over." And they hear another bang and they're on the floor again. What's happening isn't a problem with their cognitive part of their brain. It's a problem going on in the limbic system of the brain, our fight, flight, freeze, and submissive mechanism. And again, if you believe that you have no control over your body reactions, that's going to drive a negative sense of life. Because there you are thinking, well, I can think straight, I can add, you know, I can write sentences, I can do my job, but when I have these reactions, I can't cope, I can't behave, I have no agency, it suddenly seems to be gone. And as a result of that, people will often say, okay, I am powerless, there is nothing I can do, and develop quite a negative, depressive way of seeing the world. And the really tragic thing about that, and what's been fantastic about the breakthroughs of research, is that it's not really your fault when that happens. It's not your fault at all, actually. Until that has to physiologically be repaired in the brain, and we have many interventions of ways of doing that. But it's a real tragedy that so many people will say, this is what I hear a lot, "I'm such an idiot. I'm such an effing idiot because I froze when someone shouted at me." Without being able to take on board that actually that's a repetition of maybe something deep from early childhood when someone was screaming and shouting at you all the time, maybe an aggressive teacher, maybe an aggressive parent, etc. And that has just been instilled in the central nervous system. And what has to happen is we have to develop skills and ways of working through that to, in a way, reset the central nervous system. And there's a whole load of work we can do working what we call heart rate variance. And I implore people to look up devices like HeartMath, the Aura Ring, etc. These are all tools now that we can do on ourselves and with the guidance of a coach or a therapist to learn to reset our central nervous system. Because, you know, I could think that I'm all right, And then I keep having these reactions, and after time I'm just going to end up isolating, because going out into the world just becomes too stressful. And then I don't believe I can cope, and then I start integrating the world's not the kind of place that I want to live in, and I start slowly developing a much more negative sense of life. And all of this ties into self-esteem. The self-esteem movement's had quite a bad rap, and I'm not surprised, because it tried to undercut the whole concept of self-esteem. Self-esteem has two core parts to it. We have to ask ourselves, am I able to cope with the basic challenges of life and the world? And am I worthy? And the self-esteem movement that sort of grew up, that sort of, we read about in the papers, etc., that everyone gets a gold star, or everyone gets a clap, or everyone gets to finish first in the race, etc., undercuts that first part, am I able? And someone who with a low self-esteem is going to be having a very low or negative sense of life. Thank you. So we have to look at that, and you have to ask yourselves, am I able? What are my skill set in life? And the surest way to turn around a low self-esteem, and this is a universal technique, is to set yourself small, realistic goals and achieve them. And I come from a background of addiction. I'm working with that, and some of you may know about 12-step programs, but one of the core concepts or core beliefs in core methods within a 12-step program is that people develop all sorts of skills by turning up to meetings and taking on what we call various service positions, etc. And they start to learn to build up those skills, and you start to see someone's whole aura change, because they're taking these very small steps, and with the achievement of each of those steps is a sort of micro increase in self-esteem. And over time, you can see, again, I've got clients who come and see me, and they've got, like, to begin with, they will have, I don't know, super long nails, kind of flashy hair, maybe clothes that we might say are a little bit age inappropriate. We might say that 40-somethings dressing as teenagers, etc. And over time, you'll just see this change in esteem in the way people dress and present themselves. And I see this quite a lot. It's really interesting. I often see, like, people with very dyed blonde hair within a year go back to their natural color and be proud of that and like that. And I see this kind of sense of life change in the behavior. And that comes from just a very slow, gentle process of setting very small goals and achieving them. Like, if you take addiction, an alcoholic, the initial goal may be, I'm not going to drink for this hour. And they get through that hour, and it's like, okay, and then it moves to, I'm not going to drink for a day. Then it's, I'm not going to drink for a week. And then a month, and so on. And just setting these small goals is what really elevates self-esteem and self-worth. So the setting of goals increases that and answers that question, am I able? With self-esteem. And as a result of being able, one's self-worth rises. So you start developing these virtuous cycles. Now, the most surefire way to start changing one's sense of life is actually to start journaling, to start really taking one's own personal inventory, writing out things like your values hierarchy. Not values hierarchy, let me rewind a little bit. Just writing down, and what are all the things that I truly value? Who am I? What do I like? What are the films I like? What are the TV shows I like? What are the books I like? What is the art that I like? What are the sports I like? And really start taking yourself more seriously. And then turning that once you've got that awareness of your values, start living your values. Start looking at what are they? What order? What is my preference? What is the hierarchy of my values? And honoring that. Because so many people I see don't live up to what we call their values hierarchy. The most important thing in your life might be your work, yet you keep putting your husband's football first. And over time you become bitter and resentful because you're not honoring the fact that actually your career is more important to you. Now, a lot of people don't even know that that's what's going on. Again, we have to bring an awareness to this. That reading that I spoke about at the beginning, that I read out, talked about an implicit view of life. And we have to start making these things explicit to be able to change them. So we have to look at the way we think. We have to look at the way our body responds. We have to look at the things that we really value. We have to look at where we've come from. What are my genetics? What was my environment? And what is the way I think? How do I think? So those are, all areas that inform one's sense of life. And those are the areas that if we start changing them, your whole sense of life will change. And I thought it might be quite good to do an exercise if someone would like to volunteer. Because the closest thing that I see to sense of life in sort of mainstream psychology is the concepts of optimism and pessimism. We might say that someone who has a benign or benevolent sense of life is an optimist, and someone who has a negative sense of life is a pessimist. Now, the definitions of optimism and pessimism have changed quite a lot. Optimism used to be called, what's now called dispositional optimism. It used to be, and it's still very much out there in common language, that an optimist is someone who sees that a glass is half full. Yeah, most people recognize that one. Yeah. And a pessimist will see that it's half empty. And we call that dispositional, one's disposition towards how things are. And they used to believe that that was set in stone. One was just born that way. So optimism was a concept that wasn't even really taken seriously in psychology at all. And then in the 1990s, Martin Seligman started looking at the concept of optimism. And he's changed the way we look at it. He actually now says that optimism is actually the way we explain how events happen. And an optimist will be able to frame events in sort of singular terms. Let's say a negative event happens, like your girlfriend is late to the cinema. An optimist will say, okay, that was a one-off event. And we'll start to think, okay, well, maybe, I don't know how many of you got the tube here today, but my tube journey was a nightmare today. But it's not always a nightmare, but it was today. I'm able to see that. But a pessimist will just say that after one singular event, that means that all tube journeys will always be terrible. And an optimist will say, well, that one particular journey was terrible. And that way we think is quite automatic, which ties into this idea of a sense of life being kind of almost automatic, driven by our subconscious. And there are specific techniques to change the way we explain events. And I'll give you one today that I think is quite a good one to do. I often do this in groups and it works really well. And I was wondering if there's anyone here who's got I don't want to say a major challenge because it might take a while, but a sort of minor challenge that they're really struggling with at the moment. Yeah?
So it's an interesting one. So at work, I've been given an extra voluntary responsibility.
An extra voluntary responsibility.
Exactly. So
You've been given it, so it's not voluntary.
so staff rep.
Okay.
So I've met the criteria, and HR would like me to do it.
Yeah.
But it requires my boss supporting me.
Yeah.
And my boss is kind of sort of trying to guilt trip me a little bit, going, oh, but you know, what about our work? And so I already spent an hour with HR with my boss, and they already know the impact, and they already agreed to it. And now my boss is trying to say, I still want to be in control, though. I still want to say some days you can do it, some days you can't do it, and it's frustrating for me because I'm really passionate about it, and my boss won't support it, and I know why. But it's like, how can you can't control your toxic work environment sometimes?
Yeah.
Have you got any suggestions?
So how do you describe what we call the adversity of this situation? What is the actual real issue then?
Well, the real issue is that my boss is going to speak to HR and make a final decision as to whether she's going to support it, even though she said she already is. But the real issue is that, I guess, the bitterness that I feel about, you know, not having control over my career being held back by...
Okay, so my career is being held back by someone above me. Okay. So what are the main core beliefs you have about yourself in relation to this event? So the first bit I said A is for adversity. So if those of you who want to have a method, the A is stands for adversity. And the B are the beliefs. What are the main beliefs that you have about yourself in relation to this problem?
Based on the past 3 years of working with this person, I believe that not much will change in my situations. It's not changed in the past, but I've taken steps over the last 2 months to apply for this and get this. I'm trying to change my career, but I'm still being held back. So I'm negative about it based on past experience. I know how things work.
Okay, so this is falling into the domain of control that when I was talking about the 4 main domains of negative cognition. So I'm kind of powerless here. I've got no options. Okay, so you'd write that down. Are there any other beliefs that you have about yourself in relation to this?
Probably kind of self-worth from childhood, from what you said.
Yeah.
Which affected me when I started working, so I was brought up to be a people pleaser. So I did everything I was asked to do when I started working.
Yeah.
And I started getting back pain because I was doing so much work. And then I started realising I need to start putting myself first, not my employer first.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So how do you judge yourself for that? Because you did those things.
I think I judge myself as I failed myself.
I'm a failure?
I've got back pain and I've got debt from paying for, back pain, and I should have done things.
Okay.
I shouldn't have let this get down.
So in this sort of situation, usually someone would say, and any of these that are true, I'd write down, I'm a failure, I'm weak, I'm inadequate, I'm not taken seriously, so therefore I'm unlovable, something like that. These are the sorts of things that people start to say. So what I do is I encourage you to write down all the negative beliefs that you have about yourself. So I'm just going to, I didn't catch your name, sorry.
My name's Hattie.
Hattie. So Hattie, what have you written down, if you don't mind sharing with us, under B?
You were saying about negative beliefs, like being a failure.
So if we just take, I'm a failure. Yeah. When you tell yourself I'm a failure, what does that make you do, not do, or feel as a consequence of that belief? So the C, we've gone A, B, C. The C is the consequences of that belief. What are the things that it makes you do, not do, and feel as a result of having that belief? And I don't need you to go into a million different things now, because we're not in a therapy session, etc. But maybe just maybe 2 or 3 things that belief makes you do or not do. Does it make you work too hard? Or does it make you get angry? Or does it make you isolate? Or does it make you sit there distracted when you really need to get on with your work? Yeah. Yeah. All of those things, yeah. So actually, when we look at that, so you've got a list of consequences from that belief. Yeah. And usually working with a client, you may have 5 or 6 beliefs in the B, and we'd have a huge long list of the consequences. The consequences tend to usually merge, but it's usually things to do with isolate. Maybe I isolate, or I become, I go out too much, or I eat too much, and all these are the other things that happen as well as a result of trying to manage the feelings that come up from those beliefs. But the issue here is not the C. The consequences are not the issue in trying to change this. It's the belief that needs to be challenged. So what we have to do is we have to have what we call the next section, what we call the disputation. So we've got A, B, C, D. We're now into the D, the disputation. This is where you have to come up with evidence, and you have to literally imagine that there's a prosecution out there. You're in court, and the prosecution are telling you you are a failure and giving you all the reasons why you're a failure. And you have to work in conjunction with your legal team. If you don't have that concept in here, you'll just undercut everything of why that's all wrong. So you have to come up with evidence of why you are not a failure. What would your defense team come up with? Because every time you offer to your defense team like something that the other side would use, they would just put that aside. They say, we're not going to be using that in court. And you have to allow yourself to look at the whole picture. So what might be just a couple of examples to dispute the fact that you're not a failure?
I've worked really hard to apply for this role, and HR said that I meet the criteria.
Yeah, so I'm good enough for the role. I'm more than good enough for the role. But this will go deeper than that. What would be some of the other reasons to show that you're not a failure? Not sure. Fair enough. So this is where my role as a therapist or counsellor or whatever you want to call it would come in, and we'd start to gently try and guide some reasons. But I could come up with a couple now. I don't even know you, but you're taking your life seriously. You've come to a talk on happiness, sense of life, etc. I presume you said you've worked really hard to get there. So you have I presume maybe did you get a degree? Yeah, so I have all this evidence of the fact that I'm not a failure. Do you have friends? Yeah, so I've got loads of friends. These things, as I start saying them to you, you start nodding and it starts coming through. And what we'd ask you to do is to write all these things out. And usually you would come up with a huge list of what we call the disputation section of this piece of work. And then I would say, okay, read through the D and tell me how you feel then. And at an absolute minimum, someone will say I'm a bit calmer, or I'm a little bit less anxious. But normally people will say something like, I feel light, I feel energized, I feel okay. These sorts of things. And that's a change in the way you think, and it's challenging the way you see and explain events. And those subtle, slow changes are what changes your disposition from being a pessimist towards being an optimist. Now, it's quite a frightening statistic, but it's true that if you divide the population into 4 quartiles, and top quartile is the optimists and the bottom quartile is pessimists, and then you have mildly optimistic and mildly pessimistic. The people in the top quartile, the optimists, live about 20 years longer on average than pessimists. Anyone have any idea why? Yeah. It's exactly that. It's exactly just the reason that over a lifetime, that amount of stress generated by negative thinking really impacts one's autonomic nervous system, which then impacts the heart. there's not really much of a correlation between optimism and pessimism and cancer, but there's a huge correlation between optimism, pessimism, and heart disease. Every time you think negatively, you're stressing out your whole system. And the more we can change the way you think, biggest impact that has on your whole being. So I employ, and so that little example we did just now with you, Hattie, you can start doing that. If you keep practicing it and practicing and practicing that, it's hard to do to begin with. And there's usually a tremendous resistance to the disputation section because the way we think and respond is so automatized. But what we have to do is we have to bring awareness to it to start changing it. Yeah.
And off the back of that,
Yeah.
when do you kind of let go? So like, I'll give you an example. If someone believes that they deserve more and they
Yeah.
keep fighting, for example, for a better grade or something like that. I read something before coming here that the university awarded them a grade C and they wanted a grade A, and they kept fighting. The university kept saying no. In any situation, at what point do you say, okay, they've decided there's nothing I can do about it, it's fine, or do you keep saying no, actually, I am going to fight for my rights because that's what I deserve?
Did they deserve an A though?
I think they sued for thousands and I think they lost. So like in my case, for example, I got a 2-2. I emailed my university and they said, that's your final grade. And I said, that's fair enough. I didn't work hard enough. I accepted it.
Yeah.
Whereas my sister would dispute it and keep going until she got what she wanted. So that's maybe a difference in how my sister and myself would approach things. But what would be your take on it?
It would be so contextual on I'll give you a different. So when I'm working a lot with traumatized people, one of the things that happens with trauma is it really affects the thinking. And we often, when we're doing the training in trauma, we always use road traffic accidents as the example. I've never, ever had anyone refer to me for a road traffic accident, and none of my colleagues have. But for some reason, this is always what's used in the textbooks. But if you had someone who came along and said, I was in a car crash, and I caused the car crash because I was negligent on the roundabout and I didn't look where I was going, and I'm deeply affected by this, and they want to be able to change the way they think about themselves, and they would want to say, I'm a good driver. I would have to say to them, the evidence seems to say that you're not a good driver. So what would we do to help change the thinking there? We add one word, which makes all the difference. I can be a good driver. I can is a really important part of this. So when we're in situations where we're up against something or we haven't satisfied what we wanted to satisfy, etc., adding that into the cognitive chain is what really makes a huge difference. Because when someone accepts that they can change, it shows that they have agency. And a sense of agency is what really distinguishes a depressive from a non-depressive. Yeah. But to answer your question, it's really difficult because you would have to always look at the evidence. Like get a second or third opinion on whether your grade is an A or not. That makes sense? Does that help answer that? Yeah. So we do have these techniques, but that ABCDE technique is one of the most powerful I've seen that people are able to do on their own. So what I want to get across to you is that there are many reasons why we might have a malign or negative sense of life that's rooted often in attachment and trauma issues as a child. But there are things you can do as an adult, even quite simply, to start changing that. The biggest issue I run into is people want to be fixed and changed almost immediately. And that just doesn't happen because one's sense of life is determined by an early lifetime of experiences built up on them, built up on them, built up on them, built up on. That needs to be unwound. And we can't do that in like 5 sessions. It requires a lot of hard work. But doing that example we did just now, like just doing that every day for a few weeks, will make a tremendous difference to the way you see the world and you see yourself in the world. And then we start generating what we call virtuous cycles. You know, like what we might find, a good example of a virtuous cycle is, I've been working with someone who horrifically abused, and they couldn't sleep. And I actually was privileged to see, they videoed themselves sleeping, and when they slept, you could see this is really, 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 really troubled sleep. Twitching, spasming, all over the place. And you start doing the work, and they said, oh, I slept a little bit better last night. And because they slept a little bit better, they had a little bit more REM sleep. And because they had a little bit more REM sleep, they were able to start processing the anxieties better. So that the next day, they slept even better. And they slept even better because what we're actually doing as psychologists and therapists is we're acting like a catalyst to change. There's a lot of people that argue that the mind and the psyche has a propensity to heal in the same way that the body does. You know, if I cut myself and it gets full of stones, you know, when as a kid you grazed yourself and it's full of gravel and bits and everything, but imagine I get like some stones in my wound. My body keeps trying to heal, but it can't because there's a stone in the way. And it might go a bit manky or whatever. But if we remove that stone, then it heals. And I often find something very similar starts to happen with the brain and one's consciousness. Is that if we start removing some of those equivalent of the stones, these virtuous cycles start to come into effect. You sleep better. Because you sleep better, you have more energy, you have more ability to make rational decisions. As you're able to make more rational decisions, I'll come to you in a sec. Because of that, life gets a little bit easier, and you know, it just starts to, it doesn't often take a huge amount to sort of halt the negativity and turn it around. But it does require effort, and it requires effort from yourself. You can't do it. No one can do it for you. I can't do it for you. I can just help on the journey. And I can help on the journey because I'm very experienced now. Yes?
First question about A, B, C, and D.
Yeah.
And E.
Yeah, E technically stands for energization, but it's what happens to you when you go through the disputation phase. What's the change compared to the C? So if you look at the causal connection between the beliefs and the consequences, and then you look at the causal connection between the disputation and the energization, that's what's really powerful. And that's often where the change comes. It's like, I can see myself on this piece of paper, and I can actually see the different positions that I take and how they affect me and how they make me feel. Another really powerful exercise, I'll come to you just in a sec, while I remember, to help changing, there's two actually, they're very interrelated, that really start to help change your sense of life and how you see yourself in the world and reframe. One is just simply to write gratitude lists. Does anyone here write gratitude lists? Yeah. Gratitude lists work really well, but there's one problem with a gratitude list is that they wear off quite quickly. The reason they wear off quite quickly is people usually write the same thing down all the time. I'm grateful to live in London. I'm grateful to live in a first world country. I'm grateful for my job. I'm grateful for my whatever it is. And they keep repeating that. So there's a little technique that I try and put across to people with gratitude lists is try and think of something that you're grateful for that you've done. Try and think of something grateful that you're grateful for that someone in your sort of immediate social circle has done. And then try and come up with something that you're grateful for that's got nothing to do with you. You're really grateful that someone wrote that beautiful poem, or you're really grateful that someone wrote that book, or you're really grateful that that movie was made. That's nothing to do with you. And then you can even come up with something called gratitude chains, which if you really want to get into there, like you might sit there with your cup of coffee and you might look into all the ways that coffee got to you that had nothing to do with you. And it's amazing what powerful emotions come out of gratitude lists and really getting into gratitude. And you can even expand that to a gratitude visit, which is when you think of someone in your life who's still alive that maybe you lost touch with, and they actually really had a big impact on your life. Usually it's some kind of teacher from school. You know, we usually, like, most people will say, I hate most of my teachers, but there was one that really made a difference to me, and actually I never really thanked them. And so with a gratitude visit, what you do is you write a letter to the person that you're grateful for and you lost touch with. And then what you do is you arrange to meet that person if possible. And then you do, and you read that letter out to them. And apparently both of you burst into tears. And that exercise has more of an impact on depression than any other one that we've come up with so far in terms of lifting depression. You feel great, they feel great, and you get this positive multiplication effect. And that's just coming out of gratitude. So gratitude lists, gratitude chains, gratitude visits, really powerful in changing the way you see yourself and you see the world. The other one to do with that you can do as well is something called a blessings journal. It's quite famous now. But what you do with that is slightly different to gratitude list. So I write gratitude list in the morning and I do my blessings at the end. And when I don't do it, I suffer. When I do it, my life is better than when I don't do it. And I probably do it 4 times a week. I try to do it, and then life gets in the way, and then I come round and so on. But the blessings journal, what you do is, at the end of the day, ideally, but sometimes you do it the next morning, is to write down 3 things that went well for you that day and why. And the why is really crucial. Because there does seem to be something called, that psychologists call a negativity bias. We seem to be tuned into negativity much more. And the writing of the blessings journal at the end of the day, and this came from Martin Seligman, is you write down the 3 things that went well, and you explain why it went well. And this helps wire you towards more positivity. And it has another added effect, is that you tend to go to sleep with positivity in your mind. Because I don't know about you, but most people I know, including myself, negativity seems to take a grasp at night, much more. And there's that 3 a.m. effect as well, etc. But there does seem to be something about falling asleep and going to sleep in that time, and maybe it's to do with what one is slightly vulnerable at that time, or just the tiredness. I mean, I know that when I'm really tired, it's really hard for me to think rationally compared to, the difference between trying to write some emails late at night compared to early in the morning is enormous. But there's something about that going to sleep at night with the positivity helps you get a better sleep. And then we get these virtuous cycles again. So gratitude and blessings, I think, are really, really, really great interventions. An intervention in psychology is something that we use to intervene and change the way we are. That they really, really help change the way you see the world and help inform a more positive or benign sense of life. So what I thought would be the best thing to do now is I can see some of you are quite interested in what I'm saying and engaged with it today. So what I thought might be quite good now is actually just to open it up to questions, because I don't know about you, but I usually find that much more, the more informative part, and actually something to take away. And I was just wondering if people had particular questions that they'd like to ask. I know you were going to ask a question. And hopefully I'll do my best to answer it, and hopefully you can take something away with you that can help either just keep your benign sense of life going, or help to maybe just start to change if you think that maybe there's too much negativity in your thinking or in your life and you want to start changing that. So I thought that I'd put it out to you now and take it from there. Did you have a question? Yeah.
I did. I'm trying to remember what it was now.
Okay.
It was when you were talking about the ABC and around kind of working on your thoughts and thinking. And also what you said earlier about some experiences that people have happening very early on, sometimes before people are even verbal.
Yeah.
So potentially being very entrenched or deep-rooted. And like sometimes you might know cognitively that it's, I'm not a failure, or I'm not this, or I'm not that. But you can still, I don't know, feel that way. So I guess I was just wondering, and it might not necessarily stop you doing things, you might still carry on doing things. So for instance, I always do well in job interviews. I always get told I come across as confident, but I'm always really, really nervous.
Yeah.
I don't know, I don't think I'm explaining it very well. I guess just the reliance on the thought work. So if someone, you can do that lots, but if it's deep,
If it's a wound before the age of 7, usually we have to work on it in a more emotional way because events get stored. So something bad happens. Let's say there's like someone who's abusive before, and not in any way, and you're 5, 6. It tends to get stored emotionally without much cognitive work. So it's much harder to access, But when we talk to a 10-year-old, they say that was a bad man. But when it's before 7, usually it's just like, oh, that just all feels wrong. So there are certain techniques and things that we have to do. There's a lot of like body work that needs to be done. It almost has to be released from the nervous system. There's somatic experiencing. There's trauma-focused yoga. There's a bunch of body work techniques that are really helpful with that. And so it does have to be looked at a bit differently usually when it's that young. Does that make sense? Yeah.
In relation to that as well, if they're under the age of 7 and they had some sort of, quite likely that they won't even know what it is, and they'll say, I really didn't have a traumatic childhood.
Well, no, everyone in assessment says they had a great childhood. Everyone. Then they start telling you. I mean, I remember one person said that he had a wonderful childhood, and then the next sentence he's telling me that he wrote home to his mum every single day for a year to be taken out of school, aged 8. But there's this automatic, I had a great childhood. It's just a sort of a sad running joke in psychology that everybody had a great childhood until they start talking about it. Sadly. Yes.
There's another trauma that's called intergenerational trauma, and I was wondering if you, you're any chance that you are able to stop the trauma itself, as work through.
So you're asking about generational trauma?
Yeah.
I'm not even sure how true that is about the generational trauma thing. It makes total sense on one level that, like, a mum that is traumatized, has PTSD for some reason, struggles to bond with the baby, and this thing keeps going and keeps going. But the idea that it's sort of stored genetically in kind of that way, epigenetically maybe, but it can definitely be halted and changed very quickly. One of the great things about working with trauma is trauma work is curative. A lot of conditions we're working with are chronic and they have to be managed. So addiction is an example of that once someone crosses a line, addiction then has to be something that you manage for the rest of your life. You avoid certain things, you do certain other things to help with that, etc. But the work with trauma is once it's gone, it's gone. It doesn't come back. And there's a lot of reasons for that I don't have time to go into right now. But basically, traumatic information is stuck in the wrong part of the brain, and once it's moved from what we call an episodic form to a narrative form, it just will always remain in the narrative form. So there are lots of things we can do to halt those conditions that mean that something's repeated generation after generation. Does that help? Or maybe come and talk to me afterwards. Yeah.
Can I just say on that?
Yeah.
What about the link, though, I guess, between, I'm just thinking of trauma that's happened many times and how that impacts on a person's identity as
Yeah.
opposed to a one-off trauma.
Yeah.
Can that then be something that's just gone? I guess it's similar to addiction, and it might be something that you do have to continue to manage forever because it's wrapped up in
Usually, once you've been through a process of healing the trauma, you develop a certain kind of resilience that stops the repetition of that happening. That's often what we find. Yeah. Yes.
This is regarding something that you
Yeah.
You said that most
I think it's more from it's the only thing they knew. So my childhood experience, early childhood experience, was uniquely mine, and that's the only thing I knew. I didn't really have much to compare it to until I get older, and then I start hearing that, like, people were read bedtime stories and people were fed regularly, and all these sorts of things. Like, and then after a while, people are like, oh, maybe it wasn't.
But then that's just kind of a rhetorical answer. Just the only thing one, as an automatic kind of response, oh, I had a great childhood, without actually thinking about it.
It's not 100% true that everyone says that, but most of the time, that's what people say. Yeah, people have some kind of people often have a loyalty to their parents that they don't want to break, and all sorts of other factors. They don't trust this person in front of them. Like when someone comes to see me for the first time, they're like sussing me out. Who the hell is this guy? And so on. So I'm not going to reveal too much until they feel safe to be able to.
Yes, it's not a matter of being falsely optimistic, but rather it's more of a contextual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. I'll come to you next. Yeah.
It comes to, resilience.
Yes.
But then, I don't know, maybe it's too much of a gap to say this, but adults nowadays, having a really life,
Yeah.
when they have
Yeah.
accept themselves, and not taking responsibility,
Yeah.
but they are not taking any
Yeah.
expectation. How in that case, talk about a sense of life. I mean, life is about challenge anyway. And I work with foster children
Yeah.
that come from
Very difficult. Yeah.
and I see them being true and not because they're children, but as well they kind of take challenge, So the foster family, they have to have rules, as well as to show them that not all punishment are bad, but because some of them had no punishment whatsoever, they were fine. So putting limits on the parent or the guardian is kind of their responsibility. How do you, in that case, talk about children? I have really, I'm not going to say really having trauma, but you see them taking on challenge and life, how do you say it? Full
Yeah.
on. And then you have, the other side, children have trainings a day, have iPod or whatever they want, and they have no sense of life, they just go to nothing. When they come and say, I have pressure anymore, what have you taken in your life? What step did you take? Like A, B, C, D, you need to have certain values, certain code that comes from your family. And even if that family is dramatic, you still have learned something from that.
Well, you have to. Yeah. Well, there are large schools of thought out there that everything is deterministic, that everything is either determined by your genes, your environment, and nothing you do makes any difference. And people are often taught this. Oh, the reason, and even with colleagues, they say, "Oh, the reason that you are doing this is because such and such was mean to you." And there are elements of that, but there are huge elements that actually we can change. That the research shows that everything isn't predetermined and that you can make a difference. But that's a matter of education. And I'm afraid a lot of the kids are being taught by their elders that nothing they do is their fault, that there is no agency. Some really good place to read about this is Angela Duckworth's work on grit. Yeah. Because she went into the inner city schools in her story. You can read about her story much better than I'm going to surmise. But she went to the inner city schools believing that everything was environmental, and then actually she found out that's not true at all. So I'd say that would be a really great reference for you to look into that. So her book, Grit by Angela Duckworth. She's also got a very good TED Talk where she talks about this as well. Duckworth. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You had a question, didn't you? Yeah.
So when you were saying at the beginning that there are people that are very positive, that
Yeah.
like the room, would you think that most of those people have gone through therapy before, like in general?
Now, I'd say most of those people had a healthy attachment as a child.
So they wouldn't really need therapy?
No, they usually, I mean, they might need some coaching and some guidance, etc., in certain areas. But in general, we find that most people who are able to stay in healthy romantic relationships, maintain relationships with friends, etc., will have a healthy attachment, a secure attachment as a child. If you want to ask a child, if you want to see how well a child is doing in terms of, if you want to find out whether they've got a secure attachment or not, and I don't know, they're aged 8 to 10, 12, something like that, ask them how their mum is. And a child with a secure attachment will go, what are you talking about? She's fine, I guess. They'd be like that. Because everything's great. It's strange to them. And a child with an insecure attachment will say, oh, well, mum's not very well, and dad's this, and da-da-da-da-da-da. Yeah. Also, a sort of deeper question you can ask a child is, like, who did you go to for comfort as a child? And those with a secure attachment will name a parent. And those with an insecure attachment style, the different variations of that, will say something like, no one. Or I went to my room, or I read my book, and so on. But if they say, oh, usually those with the secure attachment immediately go, well, mum. Of course I went to mum when I was upset. The interesting thing about the people that I mentioned that we don't see much in the therapy room is they're the people that are being studied now to see what they're doing right, which has taken a long time, but that's the part of the basis of the whole positive psychology movement, is what are flourishing people doing that enables them to flourish? And they're being studied scientifically and extrapolating from the data many of the things that they're doing. They're practicing gratitude, they're okay with positive emotions, they have meaning in their life, they have positive relationships, they have a sense of accomplishment, and so on. These are all factors that all come together for flourishing. Yes?
I work as a teacher, so
Yeah.
the thing that astounds me most is if two siblings have gone through quite significant trauma, how can you explain the differences between the way in which people process trauma? The fact they've both gone through this, but one is seemingly dealing with their GCSEs and what have you, whereas the other has become quite abusive and socially withdrawn.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, and that's what helps us show that everything isn't one's genetics and environment. There is a sense of, I would say, free will in here. There's also, even within going through the same experience, they would have had very differing experiences within that overall experience. You might have found that one of the children was a favorite of a parent, or one of them had a football club where there was a really nice coach, or their IQ could have a big difference to that. What are the things that they love doing? Different values, etc. But there's an interesting article. I haven't got it on me. I can't remember. But Gina Gorlin has done an interesting paper about intellectual honesty. But within that, she references that there's 40 to 60% of people's behaviour that's not explained by genetics and not explained by environment. That is looking at exactly what you're talking about there. Is down to what are the choices that the different children have made? What is the style of thinking? How have they been educated slightly differently? How are their peer groups slightly different? There's so many factors at play. But one of the things that people don't do is they don't ask them. Often one of the surest way to find out is to ask someone. How did you get through this? And they'll often say this, and how come you do it sensitively in a sensitive manner, but how come this was so difficult for you? And they'll tell you, if they trust you. That's the hardest bit. One has to be safe first to be able to go anywhere with this work. Has to feel safe. Yeah, I'll come back to you. There was someone else first, yeah. There was another hand just now. Is it in the middle? Okay, you go now, yeah.
I was wondering, in that case,
Yeah.
to what extent a really strong attraction towards that thing or environmental and helpful, apart from IQ and other stuff, is there?
So I missed the first part because of all the banging and everything.
I meant at what extent, at what degree, a really strong attraction, something that attracts you, I mean, a discipline, professor or whatever.
That can have a huge... Well, I would look at that in the context of values. So, like, if you had a really strong value that kept you going, drive you, and gave you meaning and purpose, that can be a massive driver of resilience versus someone who doesn't have that.
Again, don't you think often kindness helps there? Sorry.
Say that?
Kindness. For example, I've seen youth, say for example, in my house, and instead of shying away from them, I look them straight in the eye. This was one summer, just gathering, doing nothing, making lots of noise. I'm coming from work, I'm tired. And I just look them straight in the eye and say, look, can you please move? I've just come in from work. Just plainly as I've just said. And I got a blank stare, and I didn't look down feeling, afraid. But it was the tone that I used as well. I wasn't fearful, they weren't fearful with my approach, and they moved.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that, and in fact, one of them was my neighbour's son, and we became friends in such a way that one day we were taking shopping out the car, my family and I, and he came across and offered to help.
Nice.
What a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, often that's all kids are looking for is acknowledgement of how they feel, who they are, being seen. And I mean, one of the tragedies is kids these days want respect without earning it. This concept of respect. When you look deep underneath it, it's actually what they're saying usually is, "Don't shame me." And that's what often causes such visceral, strong reactions is the threat of being shamed. This is some very interesting work called mentalization. There's a mentalization training that came out of people in prison and how being shamed is the biggest driver for violence. Yeah. Yes? Yeah. Generational trauma. Yeah.
Trauma. I was at a conference actually, at an African conference, where there was poets and thinkers. It was an interesting. But they were saying, for example, about certain country that they had a rich culture, a rich photography, books, plans, and everything. And through that, because of most wars, so most of the time, the first thing that was destroyed was the cinemas, where the libraries, the schools,
Yeah.
and the people feeling coming up to. The problem is now there is private instinct of the parents. One of the filmmakers actually was talking about. When I came to Europe, the first priority was, and parent it still is, ensure that the children are well fed, they have good grades, and you see doctor, a lawyer, you need to have a job that makes money, and completely forgetting a big part of the culture, which the value comes from, because songs, music, especially in Africa, there is all about the songs, the movies, stories that I have true picture. There's a whole generation that the war have completely cut from. And the children now, they don't have the automatic idea of asking your parents. Because the parents are pushing the children to kind of excel and
Yeah.
put a lot of responsibility on them without giving them the values of why, I mean, Africa, but each country in Africa has different culture and value and tradition. It's really hard, especially from the Muslim community. None on the children. A lot of them are rebelling because they don't understand how, why Christianity might be a bit simpler and you go to Islam is much more strict. Parents took that strictness and this impose them on the children. So now the trauma of these children is really thinking, and that's going to be repeated on their children. I have to discipline my children. Sure that they make good grades and they kind of, the list has completely changed. It's just the one end of the spectrum that is being back and back. So I think there is a generation trauma. But how would that be treated on, I don't know, on the level of parent because they don't in their way, but on the second generation, on the third generation.
Well, as maybe I wasn't very clear earlier, is that I believe that there's generational trauma in terms of exactly how you've described, but this concept of generational trauma has come up that there's somehow imprinted in one's DNA. I'm not sure about. But I'm saying these cultural aspects, definitely, like just if your parents are traumatized, say after a war, and you can't bond with them, and then you lose out on that attachment, then you don't know how to attach properly, and then you have children and these things keep repeating. I believe that.
Attachment itself on the value, because as you said, a lot of the journaling, the gratitude, and even the belief come from your value. But if your value only comes from one extreme of the spectrum, which is, don't be weak, make sure that you have a job, make sure that your children are disciplined, and etc. Then what would you be grateful for? I mean, this kind of, it's hard for some people when
that's
have friends that
grateful I'm alive. That's the work. A lot of this you have to work hard at. You have to dig deep to find out what you could be grateful for there. But there's so many questions and there's so many angles to what you're asking. I can't give you a succinct answer right now. But what I would say is that a lot of these people are going to have to reject some of their parents' values and create their own. Don't underestimate the ability of people to create their own values. We don't just take on I've rejected loads of my parents' values, and I've accepted a whole load. And that was a process I've gone through, and that's what I would try and encourage in all people that I see, is to make sure that the values that you are trying to live by are your values. And some of those values I've taken from, some of my values are from my mum, and a lot of them aren't. And some of my values are from my dad, and some of them are values that I've taken from general society, and some of them ones that I've sort of created myself. And I think everybody has to do that. It's not deterministic.
No, but in today's society, I mean, when you already have not a lot of value from your family,
Yeah.
then, the one you have are really negative, let's say.
Yeah.
And then, because I see a lot of kids, as I said, and some of them are Muslim.
Yeah.
And then they live in the UK.
Yeah.
And then now, suddenly, the UK, it's like everything that's Muslim, it's like bad. So they go to school and they hear like, oh, there was a terrorist man, so the values are getting completely, mashed out. even the Valley Society are giving them, the friends are giving them, and the one that already, the family is already, stable. So everything is crumbling down at the end. So how, in that case, would that child take any value, as you say, because...
Well, I would ask him straight up, what do you value? And start from there. Each child would be individually different. Yeah, they might just say ice cream, I don't know, but it's a start. They might say a story I love, or a certain toy, or my teacher, or whatever it is, but I would ask them. Yeah, I'd be wary of all these sort of big outside forces that are impacting, and just ask them. Start small, yeah. Not start small, start with the individual. Yeah. Yes.
So, with addiction being a chronic
Condition, yeah.
to manage, how do you try and get somebody to see it as being chronic, as not just being a label and then...
Education. It's the only thing. I mean, what's amazing with addiction is that people are much more tolerant of addiction as an illness that needs to be worked through now than they were 20 years ago, but there's still a long way to go. And that's come from education, that's come from culture, that's come from good films that have shown that. It's come from people... Yeah. But nowadays... Yeah. Yeah, but nowadays, like, people are much more open to the fact that there's a genetic element, that there's a trauma element, there's an environmental element, and these things all come together. And for a long time, people just thought you were a bad person. And that's shifted. When you see someone who's really affected by addiction now, you can say that person's not very well. You say that there's an illness there now, whereas before people would say that was just a bad person. And that's come through education. And say that again, sorry? Yeah. Yeah. Well, you can't. The thing is, and the guidelines that we have as well, we can't make anyone do anything. Yeah, but those who want help and want to change, it's what's very interesting about the addictive population is, if you compare them to other chronic illnesses, is that once addicts have the knowledge and the treatment they've been through, you'll find that the addict population treats their chronic condition at a higher percentage than, say, diabetics and other chronic conditions do. And this was meant to be like impossible. But actually, you'll find that about 40% of most sort of chronic illnesses, people will actually manage in a healthy, responsible way. But the addictive population, once they've had treatment, is about 60%. But that comes from education, and they have to be educated that you have an illness that needs to be treated, as opposed to you're a bad person who needs to be good. Because otherwise addiction treatment would just be stop being bad and be good. And that doesn't work, because there's so many, it's an incredibly complex illness with many factors that come together that need to be looked at. Yeah. Actually, did you have another question? Yeah.
More anxious than the previous generation. And obviously there's been lots of mental health campaigns which raise awareness and say it's okay to ask for help. And then I saw a program, I can't remember if it was on so much campaign, so many of these campaigns. Gosh, I must have depression and anxiety, I should seek help. And they're saying that some people should be encouraged that it's it's so what's your thoughts?
The data does show that each generation is more depressed than the one before, and I think there are many factors at play there. One of the things that is very interesting, say, if you take trauma, is one of the theories about trauma is that something becomes traumatic when one's assumptions about the world are shattered. It's called the shattered assumption theory. And so there's much higher incidences of PTSD, for example, in LA than there is in Baghdad, when the Gulf War was going on, because it's the difference between what you expect the world to be and the reality. So if you grow up in an adverse environment, you're much less likely to have PTSD than if you grow up in a very benign environment and then something bad happens, because that's not how it's meant to be. That undercutting. If you look at some of the definitions of PTSD, the criteria in the diagnostic, the DSM-5, etc., is a shattering of how one sees the world and one's place in it. And I think there is an element of the fact that as life, every generation, there's no better time to be alive than right now, I think, in the whole world history. And I think every year that becomes more true and more true and more true. I think it's when it's because things are getting better and better and better, the contrast between the good and the difficult is wider and wider and wider, and I think that's what scares a lot of people. But it's a very good question, and a lot of people are debating this at the moment, and it's not something I've really thought about much. I come across it, and it's like it makes a bit of sense to me, and I'm curious. And I think as the way jobs and everything are changing as well, I think it has a huge part of it. That people don't do as much as they used to. One of the best ways of getting out of depression is to do things. And that's why sport was so encouraged in schools and things. And as there's less emphasis on that, and there's less emphasis on own personal responsibility, I think people believe that they are at the mercy of outside events more. So I think, the big debate at the moment is, are we meant to teach our children that they're victims, or are we meant to teach our children to become resilient? And I would say I'd be on the resilient side.
Piers Morgan apparently made a speech recently where he was saying that, children aren't taught that it's okay to fail, and he said, I was told, the other way around, he said, I was told that, I failed and I've become really good and I've learned from it. A lot of people are saying, the snowflake generation, we can't give a medal to everybody praise, but
yeah.
I understand that, but on the other hand, should you be telling your child when they're really young that you're a failure and you've got to meet my expectations?
Well, again, Angela Duckworth's work is fantastic on this in terms of, I use this example a lot, but when a kid comes to you with a painting or a drawing they've done, the best thing we can say to the kid is not look how talented you are, but look how much effort you put into that. And we need to reframe the way we talk to children. We need to emphasize how much is to do with one's own effort in there and get away from talent. Because one of the issues with talent is kids who are very talented and grow up being told they're talented all the time, they start to believe that this is something that's slightly outside of them, that just is a thing, and they're not really responsible for it. And therefore, what do they do with it? Whereas if we say to a kid, look, you put in loads of effort here, really well done, tell us how you did it, explain, when they present that picture, ask them how they did it. Don't just tell them they're really talented. And it emphasizes, yes?
Applying this mentality to addiction, I'd just like to know your opinion. I've come across a few approaches, and I think there are complete opposites in
Yeah.
end of the spectrum. For example, an addiction, alcoholism.
Yeah.
One approach is to focus on weight,
Yeah.
which is drinking.
Yeah.
And then the opposite approach would be to focus on something within behavior.
Well, with addiction, you have to look. One, you've got to create This is the approach that I come from. Is first of all, the client has to become abstinent to be able to have any real lasting change. If someone's still drinking, still taking drugs, still gambling, still acting out sexually all the time, still binge eating, etc., there's no chance of doing the psychological healing that needs to happen. So the behavioral aspect there has to be the change of behavior in there. But it also has to be a recognition that the alcohol or the drugs or something is a symptom of a root issue that's much deeper. And that's what needs to be treated. But you do have to change the behavior to then be able to do that deeper work. And so it's a combination of both.
So you see it as different levels.
Yeah, but you really need to get into the root of like why are you smashing yourself to pieces in this way? What is it about life that's so difficult for you? And also recognize that there are certain brain, addicts have a certain way the brain responds to certain chemicals differently to other people as well, and you have to recognize that.
Which one would need to come first, though?
Well, as I was saying, you really need to, in my opinion, someone needs to be abstinent before you can make any change. Yeah. But then it's done in combination. Yeah, you don't just get someone, if you tell someone just to become abstinent, they become what we call a dry drunk. And someone in a dry drunk form is almost harder to deal with than actually, you see the illness in full effect when someone's not drinking often. Yeah, you see the rage and everything that comes out. Yeah, I think we've got to finish up now. This very long Q&A we've done, and I appreciate you all staying for so long on a winter's night, and I appreciate you coming down. And if anyone's got any questions they want to ask me afterwards, please feel free to do that. But I think it's time to let you go. Yeah, so thank you.